I also wanted to talk a little bit about how it is that the self emerges or changes over time as we associate with new groups of people, as we engage in new forms of social activity. Here I want to mention another famous interactionist, Howard Becker. He created something we call labeling theory, and we're going to talk about that later in class, I'm sure. But for right now, I'm just going to point to one of his famous pieces of research, Becoming a Marijuana Smoker, to illustrate a couple basic points. Howard Becker wanted to understand how people become marijuana smokers. But he wasn't just focusing on, well, how people try it or why people try it. He was focusing on a much more fundamental question about the social self. How is it that people not only engage in marijuana smoking and smoke pot and so forth with other people, but he wanted to understand how it becomes not just something they do, it becomes who they are, or at least an important part of their sense of self. How do people get to that point? In order to study that, he went out and he interviewed and studied a lot of marijuana smokers and talked in depth about how they first started smoking pot, how other people coached them and socialized them to learn a new language, to figure out how to buy pot, how to avoid getting arrested, how to roll a joint, how to tell the difference between good pot and bad pot, and so forth and so on. These people were introduced to an entirely new culture, an entirely new way of life. And they were kind of encouraged to behave in some ways and not encouraged to behave in other ways. They were influenced even in terms of how they experienced being high. As they began to smoke pot more and more for longer periods of time, as it became a critical part of their day-to-day social life, and as it became socially reinforced, as they began to make stronger and stronger friendships and bonds with other marijuana smokers, it became more and more important to them, and eventually their sense of self began to change. They became marijuana smokers in the true sense of the term. It changed how they look at themselves, how they felt about themselves. When they looked at the mirror, they didn't just see the same old person, they saw a marijuana smoker, someone for whom smoking pot was an integral part of their sense of life, their way of living, of who they were. Now, Becker went on further to study what happened when people began to distance themselves from that social world, to leave the pot-smoking world behind and stop smoking pot. What he found was, eventually, slowly, that removal, that cutting off of that social activity changed how these people viewed themselves. Eventually, they began to think of themselves as ex-marijuana smokers. Now notice, this example illustrates how symbolic interactionists study the emerging and changing social self, how changing patterns of association, socialization, and social influence slowly, cumulatively change our sense of self. And it also illustrates how removing ourselves from one social sphere or one set of friends and beginning to engage in a different social world can change our sense of self, but usually only slowly over a period of time. Now, I also want to point out one other reason for bringing up this particular example. It's a classic example of interactionists studying the social self to better understand deviant, controversial, illegal behavior. That's one of the payoffs of studying the social self, but it's certainly not the only one. There's this huge body of research by interactionists on deviance and crime, and frankly, a lot of it does touch or focus on the study of the social self, because the idea is, if you want to understand how criminals become criminals, why they behave the way they do, or for that matter, why they change their behavior, you have to get some sense of how they look at themselves and how that came to be, and how that might change. One more idea that I want to share with you before this video is over. I want to also mention another concept related to the social self, social identities. Social identities are particular types of our self-images or self-beliefs. In this case, they're how we define ourselves in terms of the groups we belong to, the social roles we play, the social categories that we belong to. So, for example, if I define myself in terms of my job, being a professor, if that's a part of a sense of who I am, well then I'm defining myself in terms of my social identity. If I define myself in terms of my race or my gender, my ethnicity, those two would be defining myself in terms of what social categories or groups I belong to, and so forth and so on. Social identities are also commonly used by interactionists to study a wide range of social phenomena and get a better sense of why people do what they do, and so forth. One of the nice things about studying social identities is it allows us to kind of tie all this stuff about social interaction, social influences, the social self, to other things going on in societies. Things like what jobs people perform, what organizations they belong to, what groups they belong to. It allows us to kind of tie other social phenomena to stuff going on inside of people's heads and stuff going on in terms of their day-to-day interaction. Beginning to tie together micro-level phenomena, especially focusing on the social self, the things that are beginning to move a little bit more towards macro social phenomena, things like large groups, organizations, social roles, and so forth. Now, we don't have enough time to go into any more depth on social interactionism, but we're not quite done with our lecture series on major sociological theories. We're going to have a couple more. The next one, we're going to talk a little bit about comparing and contrasting these theories. And in the final one, we're going to talk a little bit about how these various theories relate to various kinds of approaches to address social issues or problems, what I call social solutions or remedies. That last video is really more for my social problems class in the introductory class, but we'll make it available to both classes to view. Well, that pretty much finishes things up for now, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.